So we are going to continue to look in Genesis. We're going to have a little bit bigger chunk of Genesis today. And it's important to kind of rehash a little bit because the theme of Genesis 1, it's important to see it as a big picture. And so it's important to know kind of the perspective that I'm coming at it from. And the first place is that we talked a lot about a couple of weeks ago about how Genesis chapter 1 is not trying to be a science book as we think of a science book. That's an unfair reading of Genesis, and it causes lots of problems, right? And it's interesting today as you look at people who have had trouble accepting God and the reality of God, and especially in the scientific community. One of the big reasons is because of disagreement that happens on Genesis chapter 1. And I wonder if maybe if sometimes we've tried too hard to convince people to believe the creation narrative in Genesis 1 rather than helping them believe in God, right? Like, you know, and I think we need to think about that a little bit. And again, if we're trying to use Genesis chapter 1 as a justification or kind of a textbook on how the world was created, we're really missing out a lot. And we're missing what it's telling us more about who God is and the wonderful creator that he is. Remember, we started off talking about in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. That was a new narrative in many ways that the world had never heard of before, that there was a beginning, that there was a specific creator, right? All of that was new. So this is teaching people then about God, right? And it also fits science. It took science a long time to catch up with the fact that there was an actual beginning, that all of this just hasn't always been. Right? And so we see that. And then we saw last week, we really talked about chaos and how God is entering into the chaos and starting to bring about order and purpose in the midst of the chaos. I think that's one of the strong points that we see throughout Genesis chapter 1. And today we're going to read. We're going to make our way all the way to verse 25, but we'll kind of be stopping and starting through all of that. So let's start just at the very beginning. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." So you have this creative force that's hovering over the chaos, that's hovering over these waters, this kind of primordial creative juices that are starting to flow, right? It's kind of a weird picture, and we can't really wrap our head completely around it. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good. He separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, the darkness he called night, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. So again, God enters into this chaotic situation, this dark situation that is confusing, chaotic, and he starts to make sense of it. And he starts to bring light. And there starts to be hope. There starts to be something that makes sense. Right? And then it says, "And there was evening and there was morning the first day." This is what we're going to at least address that, right? What does that mean? Is it a 24-hour period? The way that it's written, yeah, pretty much. But that word is actually used, and the King James Version still has it translated this way. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, it says, "These are the generations of the heaven and the earth when they were created. In the day the Lord made the heavens and the earth." That's the same word. There, it is not referring to a 24-hour period. It's talking about the whole process, right? The time period. Okay, so, and this is a tough one, and I think it's important for us in how we approach people, because I don't think it's wrong for someone to say this is a 24-hour period, and that God created in 6 24-hour days. Yes, 6 24-hour days. That's correct. Okay. So I don't think it's wrong to believe that. That's fine. Why couldn't God do that? Of course he could, right? I also, whenever you see that word, it's I believe it's tov is the Hebrew word. It's used in other places to refer to things other than 24 hours, to refer to in that time. Later in Psalms, that same word is used whenever it says to God a week is like 1,000 days, or it's basically kind of blowing up the picture of time, that God is beyond time, that God is not contained by time. Right? So those are, I think you can believe either one and maybe be right. We don't know for sure. And this is one way that I look at it. Whenever I was at the Grand Canyon, and I'm looking at the Grand Canyon, it's awe-inspiring. And to me, it's God is right in your face, right? And I started thinking about it. And I started looking at the Grand Canyon, and I could see in my head, and it made sense scientifically from what I understand. And by the way, science changes all the time. So I love it whenever science says the world is between 20 and 40 billion years old. That's a pretty big gap, right? Like, is it 20 or is it 40? That's pretty huge, right? And people are so certain. Science is come on, we don't know, okay? But as I'm looking at the Grand Canyon, I could see how a river that is running through and carving out in the earth takes millions of years to make something like the Grand Canyon. I can also see in the blink of an eye God creating a crevice in the world as the world is formed from the beginning and being there immediately. Both of those things make sense to me, right? So I am not going to argue so strongly that I push someone away from even considering believing in God, because the way that their mind is working is strictly a scientific mind. I will say, okay, God chose to create that way, a lot longer process, right? I'm not going to bind God by a 24-hour period here or there, okay? Because I do think legitimately, interpretively, there's wiggle room here. This word is not guaranteeing us that it's talking about a 24-hour period, okay? So that's where that is. Again, I have no problem also believing that God created in 7 days, but why would God need 7 days? He could have done it just like that, right? I mean, God could do either one. So that's an important aspect, and I think it's one that we should be able to debate in a healthy way rather than in a really ugly way where it has been, that I believe has caused and pushed people to atheism. And that is not the purpose of Genesis chapter 1, right? And so we see that. We see this first day. So now we have light and dark. So God has separated things out. So what you're going to see is these first few days, right, that God is separating things. So he separates light and dark. And then verse 6, and God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it, and it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening, and there was morning the second day. Very literal reading of this, all right? This kind of stuff, people get upset, and so please do not get upset. A literal reading of this is a picture of a line of water. A vault is a dome, right? It is pushing, separating the water. So you have water everywhere. It's separating the water. So now there is water above the vault and water below, and there is sky in the middle. You get kind of the picture? That's one of the reasons that the Catholic Church, for a long time believed the world was flat. Because this is kind of the picture that it gives. Whenever you read, there's places in Psalms that talk about opening up the door to heaven and the water falling through. They believe that literally if you opened up the vault, that water would come through. Why? Because God at the beginning separated the water from the water. Okay? Now, it's, again, creating a picture here. It's a picture of what is going on and something that they can see. All right? Also, interestingly, scientifically, there are many who believe that our world at one point was completely covered with water. All right? There are those, and that's a non-creation believing, a godly creation believing scientists believe that the world was covered with water. And then through the Big Bang or whatever it was, that the land started to split, and you had crevices, so the water would go into the crevices and the land came up. You could actually, there are some that you can make a scientific case, the world was covered with water at one time, right? So maybe it's not as far off as what we think it is, all right? So then we keep going, and it says, so now God has separated light and dark. He separated sky and water. Now it says, and God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place. Let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and gathered the water he called seas. And God saw that it was good. All right, so now God has now separated things out. You have light, dark. You have water and sky. And then now you have land and water, right? So now everything has been given a form, right? There's kind of been parameters put around things, right? And it's pretty neat. And now God is going to go and he's going to start filling those forms up. And he's going to start giving them purpose. And he's starting getting them a function. It says, then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it according to the various kinds. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seeds according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. There was evening, there was morning, the third day. So now, God is using the forms that he's already created to start taking part in the creative process. Right? That from the land that God has created now springs forth vegetation, which is then able to produce more vegetation. Right? So all of a sudden, God has created the forms. He's separated things out. Now he's filling it up and now giving things purpose. And then it continues. And God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years, and let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God sent them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. Now, this is a very, very big section, and one that would have really spoken to people back then. Because up until this point, most cultures worshiped a god of the sun and a god of the moon. The Genesis account is specifically making that a ridiculous thought. Why would you worship something that has been created? And not only has it been created, it's been created specifically for your benefit. Right? That is not something to worship. Right? So basically what God is saying here is he creates the sun and the moon, right? And he does it so that it will benefit creation. It will benefit man. It's going to mark out days. It's going to mark out seasons, right? It is to give us light. Right? It is for us. So it makes absolutely no sense to worship such a thing as a god if it was created. That was very, very different. Most cultures and peoples then would not have viewed it that way. They would not have viewed that the sun would have been created by something, right? It was a God in itself. And so now God is saying, no, I am providing that for you. It's a pretty neat picture. Verse 20, and God said, let the waters teem with living creatures. Let the birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about in it, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the waters and the seas and let the birds increase on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning the fifth day. And then God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. So what you have on that fifth and sixth day is you have God continuing to fill up the space that he has created, right? He has created sky, so he fills it with the birds of the air. He created land. He's already filled it with plants. Now he fills it with animals and with livestock, right? And not only that, but then he gives those things a purpose and a command to continue the creative process. See, this is so wonderful to me, thinking about this creative process, because again, we established already that God is the only one who can create. He's the only one who can create something out of nothing. But that doesn't mean that he hasn't called us to be part of the creative process moving forward, that we aren't supposed to continue what he has started. See, God created this wonderful process that just moves on its own. It's kind of like a well-oiled machine. It just starts, and God got it spinning, and he said, this is what you are to do. And in the perfect circumstances, that's exactly what it does, right? And the world is a perfect place. And it is so, that speaks so highly to who God is. It tells us so much about his character, right? Again, we started off with this chaotic, just nothingness. And then God entered in and he started to give it form, right? And he started to separate things out. He started to prepare it so that it could have a purpose, so that it could have a function. And then he starts filling it up and he says, now continue this creative process. Right? Next week we're going to look solely at the process of him creating us. But I think we start already to get a picture of who God is. That God creates this form and the opportunity for purpose and finding meaning. And then he gives us what that meaning is. And he does that with all of creation, right? That a cow has purpose, right? It has a job to do. And guess what? It does it, right? Right? It eats. It continues to reproduce, right? It provides food, right? It all fits together. It's an amazing and wonderful thing that God has created. And I love it that it shows that God is a God who creates, and then he gets back and he enjoys his creation. He doesn't want to be controlling it all. It's not like that God says, oh, we're running low on cows. I guess I'm going to have to create more cows. No. He created the process, right? And there is a difference in that, isn't there? Right? Rather than God being up there kind of this God that controls everything, and so he looks, all right, we're going to need to do this over here, or we're going to make it rain over here, or we're going to do this. No, he doesn't. He doesn't do that. He steps back and he says, it is good because it's working the way that I intended for it to work. It's working the way that I created it to work. That is beautiful to me, right? Because God is giving purpose and meaning to everything, right? If we didn't have that command to continue to create and then to take care of the world, if the plants and the animals and the birds of the air weren't given that command to now be fruitful and multiply and continue on, we'd all just be sitting around waiting for what to do. But no, God actually built it within us to seek a purpose. And that's what you see within nature, right? You see those instincts. We talk about animal instinct. And you're like, oh, that's amazing. Well, yeah, it is. God did that. Animals have an instinct of what to do. And we're going to talk more about that next week because we do as well, but we can choose whether to do it or not. And that's a huge difference, right? But when we look at God's creation, what we're seeing is God's beautiful handiwork. Then once he got it started, it works beautifully. Now, because of sin and other things, it messes it up. We acknowledge that. But man, when God created, he said, it is good. And when we look at creation, we should think, man, God is good. I want to watch a video. We're going to close with this. This is a video, and many of you have probably seen it. It's about Yellowstone National Park. And back in the 1920s, they basically had gotten rid of all the wolves in that area. And it changed drastically the ecosystem. They reintroduced a pack of wolves in the 90s. And this is talking about what they have seen. And it's interesting, and I'll put a qualifier out there. I did check to see if this was true because I know there's all kinds of things. It is true, but you will find people who are very critical of this, and here's why, is they say, well, it's still not back to being perfect. It's still not back to the way that it should be. Well, no, it's not, but it's come a long way in 25 years, right? And so it is just very interesting to see what happens whenever we allow God's creation to do what it does.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And Beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed. More pools formed. More riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
You know, it's just whenever you step back, if you allow yourself to try to see the big picture, it is unbelievably complex, it's unbelievably intertwined, and it is perfectly thought out, and it is perfectly created. Because if it wasn't, you take just the wolves out of an area, and it starts to be not what it was supposed to be. Right? God's creation is so beautiful and is perfect in every way. And we need to know that that is the God that we worship. That is the God who creates us. The God who created this perfect world. He also created you. And when he created all of it, he said, it is very good. Let's pray together.